In addressing the 2019 UN Climate Action Summit, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that if we don't urgently change our ways of life, we jeopardize life itself. How many of you believe in climate change? Let's see a show of hands. It does look like a pretty full room to me. Now, I would like to ask you something else. But this time, I don't want the answers to be in plenary. Rather, I would kindly ask you to answer to yourselves. Do you recycle? Do you limit the water and energy consumption in your homes? Would you be willing to give up eating meat for the sake of the climate? Would you be willing to substantially change your ways of life for the sake of the environment and of future generations? Are you doing it already? This speech begins with the assumption that those who answered yes to this set of questions are fewer than those who raised their hands in the beginning. And I understand, I myself can't answer with a definite yes, despite my own knowledge of and concern for climate change. Climate change has been so present in our lives as a natural phenomenon with physical consequences, as a political motive, as a concept to be studied and debated, that it has come to hold a sinister, almost pathological familiarity. Its existence doesn't shock us anymore. The last COP stands testimony to the fact that our efforts to combat the climate crisis do not match our awareness of its salience. It was the biggest and most diverse of its kind, yet the most notable thing it concluded was that progress was too slow across all areas of climate action. The certainty that so far I haven't really said anything new to you makes me want to share the central dilemma of writing this speech. How does one even begin to talk about climate change in a way that doesn't only bring awareness, because of that we have plenty, but inspires action? From the COPs to the Paris Agreement, from the Secretary General of the UN to the teenagers of Fridays for Future, from the leaders of OECD countries to those of indigenous communities, we have already heard the gut-wrenching, fear-inducing, urgent portrayal of climate change. And it is a true portrayal, but judging by the progress we've made, maybe trying to scare people into action is not the right approach. Maybe it would be more productive to think about acting as a conscious choice. My goal today is to aid your choice to act. And I don't want to do that through fatalism, nor through pointing fingers or attributing blame. Instead, I want to do that through an idea that showed me how empowering and how hopeful it can be to be provided with something to believe in instead of something to fear. I want the next roughly 15 minutes to feel personal, to feel honest, to feel hopeful. I want to engage together with you in a collective reflection on the world and a collective reimagining of what it can look like. So, what is it exactly that we're going to talk about? We are going to talk about degrowth. And it all begins with this, our throughput. The energy and resource flows in and out of an economy. Callas et al. Define degrowth as a process of social and political transformation that reduces a society's throughput while improving the quality of life. The argument of degrowth is that it is possible and highly desirable for us to change our systems of living so that our resource and energy use become significantly smaller. Now, the degrowth story is very long and very complicated, as all transformative things are. But it is a story worth playing with, worth arguing in favor or against, all in all exploring from start to finish. But we don't have time for that right now. And that is why my focus will only be on a fraction, on a hopeful beginning of degrowth. I don't want to take you through the economics of this idea. Instead, I want us to understand the normative foundations of this concept so that we all become better able to judge whether it should or should not be applied in practice. I want to take you far away from a world of physicality, of empiricism, to a world of abstraction, of values and beliefs. Why? Because in my view, that is where everything always begins. Eves et al. Argue that no matter how much we neglect our beliefs, our actions cannot be separated from them. And following that, the things we collectively produce, may they be groundbreaking cultural and scientific advances or climate change, are the products of shared beliefs. It seems to me that what we believe in today is, perhaps unsurprisingly, growth of a particular kind. A mindset that defines progress as economic growth and pursues it at any cost. Professor Wendy Brown tells us that the neoliberalist doctrine that governs our societies today is indeed a system of norms, of governance, of belief, and not just an economic system. She tells us that neoliberalism transmogrifies every human domain and endeavor along with humans themselves according to a specific image of the economic. All conduct is economic conduct. All spheres of life are framed and measured by economic terms and metrics, even when those spheres are not directly monetized. In neoliberal reason and in domains governed by it, we are only and everywhere homo economicus. That is a bold and unforgiving statement, I'll give you that. But nonetheless, I would argue it is still very true. And what better proof do we have of this, if not climate change? Robin Leinchenko and Karen O'Brien tell us that we usually think of climate change as strictly an environmental problem. And they also tell us that while that understanding is fundamental, it is also incomplete. And that is because the increases in greenhouse gases and land use changes that comprise the physical, direct causes of climate change are not these prophetic, unavoidable phenomena innate to human activity. And solely conceptualizing them as causes leaves a crucial story untold. They too are caused by something else, by economic and value systems that have allowed humans to overexploit, to overproduce, to overconsume to the point of climate catastrophe. And not only have we been allowed to do so, but urged. In The Story of Stuff, Annie Leonard tells us how, in the post-World War II US, in the pursuit of economic growth, economists like Victor Lebeau were crafting new meanings for human identity by proclaiming that our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, replaced, and discarded at an ever-accelerating rate. In the Fairy Tales of Growth documentary, Professor Wendy Harcourt tells us that those growth-enhancing narratives persist to the present day. The framing of consumerism as one of the most important objectives one can pursue, as a status symbol, as a right we have, endures. We have been made to perpetually want more than what we already have, without asking how much more contentment that will bring, and definitely without asking what costs are we truly going to have to pay. Aggregated, our wealth-seeking consumerist behavior lies at the core of the climate crisis, and even more worrying, it is rendering our efforts to mitigate it useless. Now, you might be asking, oh, but what about green growth? Wasn't there a reconciliation between our economies and sustainably fighting climate change at the same time? And that is a very fair thing to ask, because we've all probably heard the belief that if we become better at using and producing energy, we can avoid climate catastrophe. That the only thing that needs to be changed isn't the pursuit of perpetual economic growth, but only the means through which we achieve this goal. And to that, my answer, which only echoes the arguments of degrowth thinkers, is that this narrative that we can keep growing and growing and growing as economies while sustainably fighting climate change at the same time comprises only a so-called fairy tale of growth. Dr. Federico De Maria tells us that indeed we have become better at producing the same things with less and cleaner energy. But while this obviously helps, it is not enough. It does not address the root problem, and that is because, as Dr. Marta Kant tells us, and I quote, "The problem is that it's been proved over the years that we use this energy that we save, or the money that we save, and we actually invest it in more consumption." So far, we have explored the possibility that what we as societies believe in today, what we value, what we pursue, doesn't serve us very well. And I would like now to explore whether or not something like degrowth might serve us better. As I've said before, I don't dare explore the logistics of putting degrowth in practice, and instead this speech only looks at the principles, at the values that underpin it. And that is why I would like to turn your attention to another definition that Calles provides us with. Degrowth involves a rethinking of the organization of society, signaled by terms such as limits, care, and depends. Limits refers to the conscious, agentic act of abstaining from, and I quote, "pursuing all that could be pursued." And it can look like limiting production, limiting consumption, limiting carbon emissions, and limiting the overall size and complexity of our systems of living. Care refers to bringing those practices conducive to the well-being of humans and planet from the outskirts of our economies to their very center. And it can look like a valuing of those crucial forms of labor that status quo economic systems do not acknowledge, let alone cherish or reward. I'm talking about the unpaid care work that goes on in each family and each household, for the children and elderly and family and household themselves. And care can also look like care for the environment, like a departure from what Leichenko and O'Brien call the dualistic view on nature, this mindset that sees humans and nature as separate entities, with the first being entitled to exploit the second, towards an understanding of this relationship that is instead symbiotic and co-constitutive. Lastly, depends refers to how we as societies decide to allocate surplus. As we've said before, the reality of today is that we use surplus and we invest it in more growth. And therefore we use surplus to generate all the problems that come with it. Calles tells us that the choices of how to spend surplus give a society its collective character. And I think he illustrates this in a very beautiful and concise manner, and that is why I would like to quote him again. He tells us that Egyptians devoted their surplus to pyramids, the Tibetans to an idle class of monks, and the Europeans of the Middle Ages to churches. Degrowth asks that we reflect on and reimagine what we want our collective character to look like. It is a concept that prioritizes human and planetary well-being over economic growth. It is a concept that asks us to reimagine, to rethink our economic system so that economic growth and expansion no longer serve as ultimate purposes, but rather as tools for securing the health and contentment of people and the healing of nature. In my view, saying that limits is central to the growth doesn't pertain to direct limitations of wealth, but rather to limitations of exploitation. By that I mean that what degrowth is intentionally restrictive about is not how much an individual can acquire or own, but rather how exploitative a society can be of nature and people. It is true that one of the consequences of degrowth is that we become less free to become infinitely richer, to pursue all there is to be pursued. But at the same time, I would argue we become more free in many important ways. And at the end of the speech, I would like to make one final mention. Systems of belief are not in any way objective facts. They are not absolute, and they are not natural laws of how the world works. Instead, they are traceable to specific instances of meaning-making. Think back to Lebeau and his attempt to redefine human identity. Think of all the moments in which collectives of people were defining and redefining their character through instances of nation building and revolutions and fights for independence, and many more other critical junctures. My call today is for you to reflect on this idea, because our critical juncture today is climate change. And if we become aware of the fact that the systems of belief on which it stands are made up, and more importantly, when and where and for what purposes they were made up, we become empowered to change them. We legitimize breaking away from the obsession with economic growth. And in its place, other beliefs can flourish. One of them is degrowth. Thank you.